Tonight we have two of the traditional business review articles. One will be on the topic of water and the other on the topic of land. And in addition, we've added a new type of article to our business review. We're featuring an article and talk on a faculty member's scholarly research area. And these are written for a broader audience beyond a traditional academic journal. And I'm very excited to introduce our first faculty member to take on this exciting initiative, Dr. Monique Bell, who will be speaking about her scholarly research in the area of wine. Thank you.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you again for coming out to our Return to Craig Talks. I'll be speaking about wine and research that I did during my sabbatical in the fall of 2020. So here's my presentation title. It's Consumer Activism and Black Wine Entrepreneurs When Protests Yield Profits, Pain, and Promises. So that's what I'll be speaking about. But before I get to that, kind of finite research topic, I want to give you a bit of background on myself and how I got to this point where I'm studying wine. All right, so it began back in 2017 when I journeyed to Oakland, California for just as kind of a birthday weekend. There was a cool event happening in Oakland called the Black Vines Festival. I can't recall now whose idea it was, but we wound up there, and that was the beginning of my journey into wine. I was truly astonished to see that this ecosystem of Black wine consumers and entrepreneurs existed. It astonished me. As you can see here, Black people drink wine, ? Or make wine. Truly, as someone who has, of course, an advanced degree, I've traveled internationally. I grew up and lived in major cities around the country, but it never occurred to me that there were Black winemakers. And so seeing this event, attending this event really made a strong impression on me. And I determined that when I had the opportunity, I was going to dig into this much more deeply. So fast forward a few years to 2019, and I've achieved the dream of earning tenure. I know there are many faculty members or people who love faculty members, so getting tenure is like the cream of the crop. But it also presents, it also presents an existential crisis. What do I do now? Who am I now? And so there I was, literally sitting in my office. Everything was fine. I'm progressing just as I should. But what comes next? Is this going to be what I do for the next 40 years? So I needed something to really spark my passion again, get me really excited about my work. So that's when I thought back to that experience at the Black Vines Festival and remembered, how astonished and engaged and compelled I was by attending that event. And so ultimately I put together a sabbatical proposal to study Black wine entrepreneurs and consumers. So I proposed doing that for one semester, completely new territory for me, but that was really kind of what propelled me as well, that this was something that was undiscovered, untested, not seen in the literature yet. So the key questions that I wanted to discover through this research, I wanted to get a sense of the state of Black wine entrepreneurs. There was no baseline. There wasn't really anything that can give us some hard statistics about what the state of Black wine business was. And so I just wanted to start there with a descriptive study to understand some key statistics around that. I was also interested in their motivations. Why would they pursue this line of work? How did they even know that it was a possibility? Because I didn't. So I really wanted to know about their motivations. Along those lines, I also was interested in any challenges and strategies that they employed. Of course, my sabbatical was approved, and guess when it happened? It was scheduled to occur in fall 2020, which brought along with it many challenges as well as many, I'd say some advantages as well. And it had the unique context that I also got to ask these entrepreneurs some more questions. namely, what were the impacts of the pandemic on their businesses, as well as George Floyd's death and the resulting protests that occurred. So just to give you some background on what we knew at the time about Black wine entrepreneurs or Black-owned wine businesses, less than 1% of wineries in the United States are Black-owned. So that gives us about a number of about 100 wineries that are Black-owned. Of the wine professionals in the United States, there's only about 2% who identify as Black. The Association of African American Vintners, which I must give my thanks to for their support, began with about 3 members. And now, 20 years later, next month, they'll be celebrating their 20th anniversary, and they have more than 100 members and supporters. All right, so I'm taking on this wine journey. I'm going to discover what's happening with wine when it comes to people of color. And here I am in Central California at Fresno State, which may seem like an imperfect place, right? It's not Napa, it's not Paso Robles, it's Central California. But in fact, that turned out to be such a benefit to me for a number of reasons. First, more than 80% of the US wine production in California happens here in California. The Central Valley is the state's largest wine grape growing region. About $4.5 billion in revenue come into the state each year through hospitality and tourism revenues. Actually, that's in the Central Valley. Fresno State, as you may know, has the first and largest bonded campus winery. So that's a point of pride for us. And then locally, there are some trailblazers who emerged from Fresno State, including Tara Gomez, who you can read about in the magazine. She was the first indigenous owner of a winery and graduated from Fresno State. We have Demetrius Porter, who's also a Fresno State alum and featured in the magazine, who has started his own wine brand. And she doesn't know that I'm doing this, but Justine Osilla as well is a current enology and viticulture student who is making her way in the world of wine as an influencer and educator. So the Central Valley in Central California is the right place to be to do this work. And as I mentioned before, all of this was happening in 2020, which may seem like imperfect timing. Yes, I had dreams during my sabbatical of driving up to the verdant hills of Napa, drinking wine and, having a great time. Of course, that didn't happen. But what did happen was the ability to use Zoom to speak to winemakers all over the world. So I actually was able to interview not only US-based Black winemakers, but those in Germany, South Africa, and New Zealand. And then I got really into it. And I thought, what was I thinking? I am a marketing professor, and I'm studying entrepreneurship. So I had to learn that literature. Again, I wasn't that well versed in wine, so I had to learn all about wine. And in conducting my research, I was going to do both the survey and interviews that I talked about on Zoom. And I hadn't been a qualitative researcher before. So once I got through that moment, I continued and did what I knew best. I looked at the survey, I collected and looked at the survey data to give us some input on the state of Black wine businesses. I released that in a report called The Study of Black Wine Entrepreneurs and gained some key insights. So 45% of those who responded to this survey are actually winemakers or brand owners, also called negociants. However, when I talk about wine entrepreneurs, I'm also talking about importers, exporters, distributors, media, event coordinators, any role that's really wine-centric. 78% of respondents identified as women. Most of these businesses were self-funded, which is incredibly important because that comes with so many extra challenges for these business owners. They reported that the #1 challenge to their business success was in fact limited capital, and the #2 challenge that they cited for Black wine businesses in general was racism. Lastly, 78% believe that racism is a greater challenge in wine than in other industries. Okay. So I still wanted some deeper insight, so that's where the interviews came in. Now, when I wrote my proposal, I proposed doing the standard 8 to 10 interviews. As you can see, I wound up doing 40 interviews during that semester away. Multiply that times about 90 minutes each interview, and that's more than 60 plus Zoom hours. All translated, and thank God for automated transcription, that turned out to be about 2,000 pages of transcripts. And so this led me to the question, I had all of this data, I really wanted to dive deeper into this research question. How did George Floyd's video recorded death and the subsequent protest impact these Black entrepreneurs in wine? And it's important that I introduce this construct of consumer activism because you might not make the connection. What does one have to do with the other? But consumer activism is a construct which is defined as a process where consumers influence how a product or service is produced, delivered, and sold. And we've seen the many sides of consumer activism. So that could be things like a boycott. We saw consumers burning their Nikes at one point in protest. But on the positive side, it could also mean an enhanced focus on a particular brand or group of brands. And so consumer activism plays a role in what I'll talk about with these Black wine entrepreneurs. As the spring of 2020 moved into the fall of 2020, there really was this Buy Black, and later which became the Drink Black movement. So as a way for people of all backgrounds, not just Black consumers, but people of all backgrounds to kind of voice their support for what was happening, they began to buy and really seek out and be interested in Black-owned brands. And this conveyed over to the wine space. As you can see here, the McBride sisters, who are well-known winemakers and supporters, came out with their own list of 67 Black-owned wineries that circulated around social media. And this is interesting because they're just one of those Black-owned wineries, but they wanted to put forth all of the wineries that they knew about to really have this collective front so consumers would know if they wanted to show their support, not only could they support the McBride sisters, but these 66 other brands as well. So the answer to the question that I asked earlier, how did George Floyd's death and the protest affect these Black wine entrepreneurs? And I want to give thanks to my co-authors who helped me parse through those 2,000 pages of transcripts. They're my colleagues at Sonoma State, Dr. Liz Tosh, Dr. Renata Schaefer, and the MBA grad student Jia Zhu. So these responses are reflective of those who are winemakers or who have wine brands. We're really focused on that group at this point. And as you can see, their responses varied and they could offer more than one response. But increased business was actually a really dominant answer. Increased invitations, increased sales, funding. We'll talk about the emotional toll and just an increased awareness of Black and social justice issues overall. So I'll share a few quotes from the interviews. The first area is in the area of profits. They saw increased profits in light of what happened, as I said, through that vehicle of consumer activism. So you can read Black Lives Matter, and it was just all very weird. And revenues, 70% increase of what they used to be. And here's another one. So I'll let you read that. So this just really speaks to, you have this kind of nationwide, even global movement happening, and it's trickling down to these entrepreneurs in a positive way. But on the flip side, it really was a double-edged sword because they're reaping these benefits, but also feeling some emotional pain themselves. You can see in the second quote, the respondent says, I had some sense of guilt. They call it survivor's guilt. And it was weird because I was in no way related to him, George Floyd, and I was in no way there, but I was related to him in the experience of a Black person. And so I've had that sense of guilt in trying to be successful in the same environment where this man had just lost his life. Another positive outcome seemed to be cooperation, so building community among these Black winemakers. And I'll highlight here one part of this second quote. When people think back to this time period, we were strongest when we came together. And one last area, promises that were delivered by those who wanted to support at the corporate level. We saw many institutions and corporations pledge that they were going to make changes to positively impact the nation. There's an article in the Washington Post that recounts that more than $50 million was pledged for racial injustice initiatives by corporations in the United States. And so all of this activity led to some optimism among the respondents, but it was cautious optimism. As you can read, they didn't want just to be another trending word or a trending topic, and they wanted the world to know really that Black businesses actually do matter, and that it's not just one point in time, but it needs to be continuous. All right, so as we moved into 2021, this is where the focus really shifted to Black contributions to wine. And you can see here the cover of Wine Enthusiast featuring the dynamic Tahira Habibi, who's the founder of the Hugh Society. So she was breaking ground in many ways, one of which being the first Black woman on the cover. And I had my own kind of moment in time where I started to garner attention. And I promise I'm not some megalomaniac. I was asked to include some personal, experiences. So that's what I'm doing here. And again, my co-author and new mentor, Dr. Liz Tosh at Sonoma State, really kicked things off with the Forbes feature that she did, which was followed by the Boston Globe coverage, Ebony Magazine, Women of the Vine and Spirits, Wine Business Monthly, and then ultimately, beyond my wildest dreams, being recognized by Wine Enthusiast as a nominee for Social Visionary of the Year. Just incredible, beyond my dreams. All right, so as we start to wrap up, I wanted to share this quote from Regine Rousseau, who is one of the entrepreneurs who I interviewed, as she talked about consumer activism. And her quote reads, "Activism takes on many forms. Like liquid, it adopts the shape of the vessel it is poured into. And when we are the vessel, it coats our hearts, loosens our tongues, and sometimes compels us to invest financially." And so I can proudly say and confirm that yes, Black people make wine, consume wine, and help power the wine industry and culture. And the asterisk this time is that through this journey, I actually learned that I had some family connections to wine that I never knew about. My paternal grandfather was a cooper, which is the person who makes barrels. And my maternal great-grandfather actually used to make a little wine at home. And so as we look to 2022 and beyond, just continued research and awareness. As I mentioned, the Black winemakers will be celebrating 20 years of existence as an organization next month in Napa and Oakland. I'll continue my research, hopefully continuing with the survey and interviews. Just here locally in Fresno, we have the Fields of Fresno Agricultural Tour, which is hosted by the Fresno Agricultural or Historical Society. So I'll be giving some talks on those tours. We'll continue to form these connections and really strengthen and empower the wine ecosystem here in Central California, and hopefully that will lead to gains for everyone. So in conclusion, let's pair inclusion and growth by supporting local wine economy here in Central California, as well as diverse owners. As the respondent said, we are strongest when we come together. Thank you so much.